Everyone, and welcome back. Today we're going to talk about the freedom of the press. Now, the freedom of the press, I often like to refer to also as our freedom to be informed, because even if we're not a reporter, we are affected by freedom of the press. Your objectives for this lesson is first, you need to be able to explain why the press needs to be free from government control. Um, Next, I'd like you to be able to explain the role of a free press in enabling and strengthening our democracy. We can't have self government without a free press. And lastly, I'd like for you to be explain the role of the people, specifically you, in utilizing the free press. So let's start our investigation. Well, what is the freedom of the press? Uh, the press includes many different types of media. In 2015, as of making this movie, the press has more forms than it ever has in history. Of course, you have print media, whether it's within magazines, newspapers, but also on television, within the news, within our 24-hour news cycle, and network television. We have radio news programming, documentaries, internet, bloggers. We could even get into the argument of tweeters and all sorts of different people are part of how we, as a people, get our information and are informed about what's going on. We want to keep journalism outside of the government to make sure that the government isn't interfering with the information that we're getting. Not everything that we hear necessarily our government wants us to hear. Having a free press that can investigate and report on what the government's doing and if it's doing something that's wrong or illegal enables us, the people, to hold the government to account. We can't react to the crimes that we don't know about. We need a press, we need journalists around to let us know what's going on. To that end, we don't want the state, we don't want the government running our media, or else they're only going to tell us the things that we want to hear. Also, to this end, the press has a right to have access to our government. This is, once again, in order for them to make sure that the government is acting in our best interest. They have the right to give sunshine onto the many different things that are going on behind the scenes within our government and let us know what's happening. So, let's pause for a question. The freedom of the press is often nicknamed, at least by me, the freedom to be informed. So, why do you think it's so important for people to have access to information about current events within a democracy or a democratic republic like us? Think on it, pause the movie, and when you're ready, restart. Great job. I look forward to discussing that question with you in class. Let's investigate the freedom of the press a little bit more. We need a free press in order to be informed. And, well, if we're going to be informed, we want to make sure that the information that we're getting is factual. If we're the boss of our country, we want to have the most factual, up-to-date information on what's going on so we can make the best decisions in governing our country, in holding our leaders to account. A free press is the most essential check that we, the people, have in keeping our government in check. And look around the world. The mark of any dictatorship is when the government has complete control over media. If the government doesn't want you to know about bad things it's doing, it will control the media. That's why keeping a free press, keeping it open, and outside of government interference is an essential, important right that our founders wanted to protect in the Bill of Rights. If you're a journalist, not a journal, you have a right to publish your findings, regardless of whether or not the government approves. And many people argue that the freedom of press gives you the right to not only access information, but to protect your sources of information. Good journalists would argue that without uh, the integrity of protecting their sources, to be able to do so in an anonymous way without possibly feeling reprisal from those who they're reporting on, well, they're not going to get good information. Also, we have a number of sunshine laws. We have a number of laws that give the press access to information if they request it. The government has to publish information within a timely manner to try to keep most of its records open. Now, of course, there are limitations on this. We'll talk about that in a little bit. But for the most part, our government is supposed to try to be an open book to the journalists. So, what are some of those limitations? Well, first off, one of the limitations is on the press itself. We're hoping that the media, that journalists will strive to make sure that the information that they're giving us is factual, is unbiased, is up to date, is through a perspective that is based on fact and not on just opinion. Now, opinion is a huge part of the news, but it's not the news. People's reactions, people's editorials, that's an important facet of us trying to process information through the news. But that shouldn't be the only basis in which we get our information. We want to make sure that those who report on the facts try to do so without bias. That means that you have an unfair preference to one particular point of view or another. If a person who's a journalist is a Democrat or Republican, we shouldn't be able to tell that through their reporting. Also, well, you can't publish lies. You can't publish something that is false, malicious, especially if it's meant to damage somebody's reputation. If you publish really horrible information about a person with no grounding on fact and present it as fact, you can be sued and pay a lot of damages because you're violating the other person's rights. Now, because we live in a society where we have a 24-hour news cycle, where opinion is deeply tied within our media, where we have so many different sources of media, and we always don't know if our sources are coming from an unbiased way, are coming from a way that is, shall we say, of good intention. It's up to us to analyze our sources of information, to try to get as many sources of information. Don't just go to people that say things that we want to hear. The news is the stuff that we have to hear. So it's important that we try to make sure the information that we get is accurate, reliable, and it's from many different sources. Lastly, well, journalists have to respect laws regarding property, privacy, national security. They can't go and barge into Kanye and Kim Kardashian's house to get pictures of them while they're hanging out in their kitchen. The press has to recognize that people have a right to privacy, to private property. They can't go and publish the launch codes of our nuclear weapons. There are certain things that are within the grounds of classified or national security information that they are not allowed to publish. Now, this is one of those things that we're going to see that the press and the government often bump heads about, and many of the cases that you'll look at within this relate to that. Well, let's go now to our next question relating to freedom of the press. And I want you to think about you. What are some of the ways that you can do your part to be informed? Remember, we have the freedom of the press, and that's our freedom to get information. So what can you do, and what do you do to be informed? So that way you, as the boss, can make the best decisions. And I want you to think on why it is important for us to get our information from multiple resources. Now you finished writing your answer. Let's think on this question. What if the freedom of the press was not protected? To try to answer that question, let's look at recent history. And let's go to the year 1989. 1989 was a year of radical upheaval around the world. We saw that in the Eastern Bloc of Europe, that many former communist nation governments were collapsing. We see the start of the fall of the Berlin Wall descending into democratic and finally one united Germany. And that spirit of protest, that spirit of standing up against oppression, had spread into the world's largest dictatorship, China. From April of 1989 through early June of 1989, protesters met in the central area of the capital city of Beijing, known as Tiananmen Square. At first in the thousands, then hundreds of thousands, and then in some estimates up to 1 million protesters met demanding greater democratization, free press, free speech rights, free religion rights, greater voice in government, demanding many rights. Uh, these protests built, and tensions between the protesters and the regime in power grew and grew. That is until June 4th of 1989, when the Chinese government sent tanks and soldiers, numbered over 250,000, to march upon these troops, armed with live ammunition. These troops opened fire on a population that was mostly students. The results were devastating. One of the most iconic images captured in this upheaval is that of the unknown rebel, also known as a tank man. If you look in the bottom left-hand corner, you can see one small white figure standing against that long line, seemingly endless, of tanks. If you look a little bit closer, you can see it's one figure, one man. Now, the true identity of this man still is not known to history. For over 20 minutes, he was captured on camera, basically in a standoff, one man, one person against these tanks, shouting at them things like, "Get out of my city, go away, you bring death." At one point, he climbed on top of the tanks, begging, trying to persuade these tanks to turn around. Eventually, he was rushed off by two men in blue suits, assumed to be working for the government, and was never to be seen again. Now, this story that I've told you about very briefly is illegal to be told in China today. If you Google Tiananmen Square, if you Google June 1989 massacre, if you Google or try to research into the tank man or unknown rebel, you're breaking the law in China. You don't have a free press. Essentially, since this massacre happened, when some estimates have up to thousands of unarmed people were killed by their own government for simply asking for a voice in government. A whole generation has grown up not even knowing about it. That's the power of a dictatorship in controlling the free press. This massacre happened. The whole world knows about it. The whole world watched it happen. Yet the people within that country aren't even allowed to learn, investigate, or know about it. That's why it's so essential that we have in our society the check on the government's power and the ability to be informed on what they're doing and hold them to account. And that's why we need a freedom of the press. That concludes this movie.